The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Riverside Grill, casting warm patterns across the white tablecloths. Margaret Hayes moved between the tables with the practiced grace of someone who'd been doing this work for 30 years. At 58, she knew every corner of this restaurant, every creak in the floorboards, every regular customer by name and preferred order. She smoothed her vest and adjusted her name tag, preparing for the dinner rush that would soon begin. The restaurant was already filling with business people and families, the gentle hum of conversation mixing with the soft classical music playing overhead. That's when she heard it. A child crying. Not the brief whimper of a scraped knee or the temporary fuss of a tired toddler, but the deep, inconsolable sobbing that spoke of something more profound. Margaret turned toward the sound and saw them at table 12, near the window overlooking the river. A man in an expensive navy suit sat rigidly, his jaw clenched, staring at the crying boy beside him as if he were a puzzle with missing pieces. The child couldn't have been more than 6 years old, dressed in a button-down shirt that seemed too formal for his small frame. His face was red and streaked with tears, his small body shaking with each sob. The other diners were beginning to notice. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. Margaret watched as the man leaned toward the boy, his voice low and urgent, though she couldn't hear the words. Whatever he was saying wasn't working. If anything, the child cried harder. Margaret had seen her share of difficult situations over the years. She'd comforted anniversary couples when reservations were lost, calmed angry customers when orders were wrong, even helped a woman who went into labor before her appetizer arrived. But something about this scene pulled at her heart in a different way. She approached the table slowly, giving them space, her hands folded in front of her apron. As she got closer, she could hear the man's frustrated whispers. "Please, Connor. Not here. Not again. You need to stop this. People are looking!" The boy named Connor only cried harder, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. "Good evening," Margaret said gently, her voice calm and warm. "My name is Margaret, and I'll be taking care of you both today." The man looked up at her, and she saw exhaustion in his eyes. Deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. "We need a few minutes," he said tightly. "I'm sorry about the noise." "No apology needed," Margaret said, crouching down slightly so she was eye-level with Connor. She didn't speak to him immediately, just waited, letting him feel her presence. His crying continued, but she noticed his eyes flicker toward her briefly. "You know what?" Margaret said softly, addressing Connor directly. "I bet you're thirsty. Crying is hard work. Would you like something to drink?" The boy's sobs hitched slightly. He didn't answer, but he was listening. "We have apple juice, lemonade, chocolate milk." She paused, watching his face. "Or maybe just a nice cold glass of regular milk?" Something shifted in Connor's expression. The crying quieted to sniffles. "Would you like that?" Margaret asked. "A big glass of milk?" Connor nodded, just barely, still hiccuping through his tears. "1 glass of milk coming right up," Margaret said, rising to her feet. She glanced at the father. "And for you, sir? Coffee black, please." The word please sounded like it took effort. "Of course. I'll be right back." As Margaret walked toward the kitchen, she felt the weight of every eye in the dining room. Her co-worker, Jenny, a bright-eyed woman in her 20s, caught her arm. "Table 12 is Thomas Brennan," Jenny whispered urgently. "As in Brennan Holdings. As in Billionaire Thomas Brennan. Are they okay? Do you need me to take it?" "They're fine," Margaret said quietly. "I've got them." In the kitchen, Margaret poured the milk herself, making sure the glass was perfectly clean, the milk cold and fresh. She added a straw, then on impulse, she asked the pastry chef for one of the chocolate chip cookies they usually saved for special occasions. When she returned to the table, Connor was no longer crying, but his face was still blotchy, his breathing uneven. Thomas Brennan sat with his hands clasped on the table, staring at his phone, as if it might provide answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "Here we are," Margaret said, placing the milk in front of Connor with gentle care. "1 glass of milk, nice and cold. And this," she set down the cookie on a small plate, "is because I think you could use something sweet." Connor's eyes widened slightly. He looked at his father, uncertain. Thomas glanced at the cookie, then at Margaret, then back at his son. It's It's fine. You can have it. Margaret placed the coffee in front of Thomas. I'll give you both a few minutes to look at the menu. No rush at all. She moved away to tend to other tables, but she kept table 12 in her peripheral vision. She watched as Connor slowly reached for the glass of milk, his small hands wrapping around it carefully. He took a sip, then another. The tension in his small shoulders began to ease just slightly. Thomas picked up his menu but didn't seem to read it. His eyes kept drifting to his son, watching him drink the milk with an expression that Margaret recognized. It was the look of someone who desperately wanted to fix something, but didn't know where to begin. Over the next 20 minutes, Margaret checked on them twice. Each time, Connor was a little calmer. He'd eaten the cookie in tiny bites, savoring each one. He still hadn't spoken, but the crisis had passed. When she returned to take their order, Thomas ordered for them both. The grilled chicken for him, plain. No sauce, and I'll have the salmon. Excellent choices, Margaret said. And Connor, how's that milk treating you? The boy looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not quite a smile, but close. It's good, he whispered, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. I'm so glad, Margaret said. Would you like another glass? Connor nodded. As the dinner service continued, Margaret found herself drawn back to table 12 more than necessary. She brought Connor his second glass of milk. She made sure his chicken was cut into manageable pieces. She noticed that Thomas barely touched his salmon. His attention constantly divided between his phone, his son, and the window overlooking the darkening river. When she brought dessert menus, Thomas waved them away. Just the check, please. Of course. Margaret prepared the bill, her mind working. Something told her to wait, to pay attention. She'd learned long ago to trust these instincts. When she returned with the check, Thomas was on his phone again, speaking in low, tense tones. I don't care what the board says. Reschedule it. No, I can't do Thursday. Because I said so. He hung up and immediately pulled out his wallet, placing a credit card on the bill without looking at the total. Margaret processed the payment and returned with the receipt. Thomas signed it quickly, adding a generous tip without seeming to notice the amount. He stood buttoning his suit jacket. Come on, Connor. We need to go. Connor slid off his chair obediently, but as they turned to leave, something happened that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. The boy stopped. He turned back to look at her, his eyes finding hers across the space between them. And then, in a voice that was small but clear, he said, Thank you for the milk. It was such a simple thing, 5 words. But the way he said them, with such careful sincerity, made Margaret's throat tighten. You're very welcome, sweetheart, she managed to say. Thomas had paused, too, turning back to see why his son had stopped. He looked at Margaret, really looked at her for the first time all evening. Thank you, he said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Something vulnerable. For being kind. That's what we're here for, Margaret said gently. They left, and Margaret cleared their table, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions. But her mind was elsewhere, with that little boy and his exhausted father, wondering what struggles they carried that she couldn't see. She didn't expect to see them again. But 3 days later, there they were. Table 12, the same time, late afternoon before the dinner rush. Connor in another too-formal shirt, Thomas in another expensive suit. This time Connor wasn't crying, but he looked anxious, his small hands fidgeting with the napkin. Margaret approached with the same calm warmth. Well, hello again. It's good to see you both. Hello, Thomas said. There was something different in his voice, less defensive perhaps. Connor, Margaret said, crouching down to his level again. I remember you. You like milk, don't you? The boy nodded, and the smallest hint of a smile touched his lips. Would you like a glass now? Yes, please. Coming right up. This visit went more smoothly. Connor ate his dinner without incident. He was quiet, but he seemed more settled. When Margaret brought him a second glass of milk without being asked, he thanked her immediately, the words coming more easily this time. Over the following weeks, they became regulars. Every Tuesday and Friday, like clockwork, Thomas and Connor would arrive at table 12. Margaret made sure she was always the one to serve them. Slowly, carefully, she began to learn their story, Not all at once, but in pieces, gathered from small comments and gentle observations. Connor's mother had died 2 years ago. Cancer, fast and cruel. Thomas had thrown himself into work, building his business empire even higher, perhaps trying to outrun his grief. But grief, Margaret knew, couldn't be outrun, and neither could the needs of a small boy who'd lost his mother. Connor barely spoke to anyone. At school, he was quiet to the point of concern. At home, Thomas employed a series of nannies who never seemed to last more than a few weeks. The crying fits happened regularly, triggered by things Thomas couldn't predict or understand. Margaret learned all this not from one conversation, but from many. A comment here, an overheard phone call there. She never pried, but she listened when they needed her to. And somewhere along the way, something shifted. Connor started talking to her. Not long conversations, but small exchanges. He told her about his toy cars, about a test at school where he got all the answers right, about a dog he saw in the park. Thomas started to relax too. His shoulders didn't look quite so rigid. He began ordering without looking at his phone. He even smiled once when Connor told Margaret a joke he'd learned from his teacher. One evening in early autumn, after they'd finished their meal, Thomas asked Margaret something unexpected. "Do you have children?" Margaret paused, her hand resting on the back of an empty chair. "I do, 2 grown sons. James is 32, lives in Seattle with his wife and daughter, and Michael is 29, just got engaged last month." "Do you see them often?" "Not as much as I'd like," Margaret said honestly. "They have their own lives now. But we talk every week and they visit when they can." Thomas nodded slowly. What was it like? Raising them? It was such a big question asked so simply. Margaret pulled out the chair and sat down, something she rarely did during her shift. But Jenny was covering her other tables, and this felt important. "Terrifying," she said with a soft laugh. "Beautiful. Exhausting. The best thing I ever did." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But I didn't do it perfectly. I made mistakes, lost my temper, worried about everything. There were days I felt like I had no idea what I was doing. But they turned out okay?" Thomas asked, and there was such hope in the question. "They turned out wonderful. Not because I was perfect, but because I loved them. Because I showed up, even on the hard days." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Connor was coloring on the paper placemat Margaret had brought him, content in his own world. "I don't know how to reach him," Thomas said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I try, but I just make it worse." Margaret's heart ached for this man who had everything money could buy but was struggling with the one thing that mattered most. "May I tell you something?" she asked gently. Thomas nodded. "I've watched you both for weeks now, and what I see is a father who's trying. You show up. You bring him here. You make sure he eats. You're doing better than you think." "He cries all the time," Thomas said, and there was such pain in his voice. "At school, at home, the nannies can't handle it." "I can't handle it." Margaret glanced at Connor, still absorbed in his coloring. She lowered her voice. "He's not crying because you're doing something wrong. He's crying because he lost his mother and he's 6 years old. And that's more pain than anyone should have to carry, let alone a child." "I know that," Thomas said, "I know. But knowing doesn't help me fix it." "Maybe it can't be fixed," Margaret said softly. "Maybe it can only be felt. And maybe what he needs isn't someone to make it stop. Maybe he just needs someone to sit with him while he feels it." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw tears gathering in his eyes. "I don't know how to do that." "You're already doing it," Margaret said. "You're here. You're trying. That's what matters." They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the restaurant washing over them like gentle waves. "He talks to you," Thomas said finally. "More than he talks to anyone else." Margaret smiled. "I bring him milk and cookies." "That helps." "It's more than that." Thomas turned to watch his son color. "He feels safe with you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. "Mr. Brennan," Margaret began, but he interrupted her. "Thomas, please." "Thomas," she started again. "Connor feels safe with me because I have nothing to prove to him. I'm not his parent. I don't need him to behave a certain way or be a certain thing. I can just be kind to him. But you," she paused, making sure he was really hearing her, "you carry the weight of everything. His future, his well-being, his healing. That's heavy. But it's also love. And somewhere inside he knows that. Thomas wiped at his eyes quickly. I'm sorry. This is... I don't usually... You don't need to apologize. Not for caring about your son. Connor looked up from his coloring then, sensing somehow that the conversation was important. Dad, are you sad? Thomas took a breath, steadying himself. And then he did something Margaret hadn't seen him do before. He reached out and put his hand on his son's shoulder, letting it rest there with gentle weight. A little bit, buddy. But it's okay. Sometimes grown-ups get sad too. Connor considered this. Then with the simple logic of childhood, he said, maybe you need some milk. Thomas laughed, a real laugh that seemed to surprise even him. Maybe I do. Margaret stood smiling. I'll get you both some milk, and maybe another cookie. As she walked toward the kitchen, she heard Connor's voice behind her. Dad, can we color together? And Thomas's response, quiet but sincere, yeah, we can do that. The weeks turned into months. Fall gave way to winter. The restaurant decorated for the holidays, strings of lights twinkling in the windows. Through it all, Thomas and Connor kept coming. Every Tuesday and Friday, sitting at table 12. The changes were subtle but significant. Connor smiled more. He tried new foods, encouraged by Margaret's gentle suggestions. He started bringing drawings to show her, pictures of dinosaurs and spaceships, and sometimes a stick figure family with a tall man, a small boy, and a woman with a name tag that said Margaret. Thomas changed, too. He started putting his phone away during dinner. He learned what made Connor laugh. He discovered that his son loved hearing stories about Thomas's own childhood, the mistakes he made, the fears he had. One Friday evening in December, as snow began to fall outside the windows, Thomas asked Margaret if she could join them for a moment when she had time. She sat down, expecting another one of their quiet conversations. Instead, Thomas pulled out an envelope and handed it to her. What's this? She asked. Open it. Inside was a check, a very large check, more money than Margaret made in 6 months. Thomas, I can't accept this. Please, he said. You've done so much for us. For Connor, for me. Let me do this. Margaret looked at the check, then at Thomas, then at Connor, who was watching her with those serious eyes. This is incredibly generous, she said slowly. But I can't take it. Not like this. Why not? Because what I did wasn't a service you can pay for. It was just being kind, being human. If I take this, it changes what we've had together. Thomas looked stricken. I didn't mean it that way. I wanted to do something, to show you how much you've meant to us. Margaret folded the check and handed it back. You can do something for me. Anything. Keep coming here. Keep having dinner with your son. Keep learning to talk to him, to laugh with him, to sit with him when he's sad. That's all I want. Thomas took the check back slowly, and she saw his hands were shaking. You've changed our lives. No, Margaret said gently. You've changed your own lives. I just brought the milk. Connor, who had been listening to all of this with a child's intense focus, spoke up. Margaret? Yes, sweetheart? My dad says you're like family. Is that okay? Margaret felt her eyes fill with tears. That's more than okay. That's wonderful. Connor reached across the table and took her hand in his small one. Good, because you make the sad stuff less sad. And there it was. The simplest, truest thing. Not fixing the pain. Not making it disappear. Just making it less sad. Making it bearable. You make it less sad for me too, Margaret said, squeezing his hand gently. That evening, as they were leaving, Connor did something new. He hugged Margaret, his small arms wrapping around her waist, his head barely reaching her chest. She hugged him back, her hand gentle on his hair. See you Tuesday, he said. See you Tuesday. Thomas shook her hand, his grip firm. Thank you. For everything. You're doing great, Margaret told him. Both of you. After they left, Margaret stood by table 12 for a moment, looking out at the snow falling on the river. Jenny came up beside her. That's the Brennan kid, right? The one who was always crying? That's him. He seems happy. He seems like he's learning to be, Margaret said. That's enough. The holidays passed. The new year came, and every Tuesday and Friday, like clockwork, Thomas and Connor arrived at table 12. Sometimes they had good days. Sometimes Connor was sad and quiet. Sometimes Thomas was stressed about work. But they kept showing up, kept trying, kept growing. Margaret watched, them with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew she'd done something that mattered. Not something big or dramatic, just small kindnesses repeated over time. A glass of milk, a listening ear, a gentle word at the right moment. And she thought about how sometimes the most important things we do are the things we don't even realize we're doing. How showing up, being present, being kind, these simple acts could change the trajectory of a life. 1E.